A belief has long been held by Floridians that the Tampa Bay area is especially protected from the devastating hurricanes that frequent the American Southeast. Dozens and dozens of dangerous storms have barreled towards this tranquil bay, only to veer away at the last second. It is a fact that the Tampa Bay area has been spared a direct hit by every major storm of the last 100 years. According to local legends, this defense is the result of a powerful native blessing. The precise cause of this blessing, however, has long been debated. In this video, we will explore the various possible origins of this meteorological protection, most of which revolve around a mysterious native tribe known as the Tocobaga. In this presentation, we will discuss the topography, archaeology, folklore, mythology, and of course, the etymology of the Tampa Bay area as they pertain to the blessing against deadly storms. The views expressed in this video do not necessarily reflect my own. Now enjoy.
Welcome to Florida, baby.
Introducing Dr. Narco Longo.
Most of our area was once again spared by major hurricane destruction. Guys, listen to this. That's why you listen to history. Some Floridians believe the sacred Tocobaga Indians had something to do with it.
Lots of them do.
Yeah. We sent Nightside reporter Stephanie Ramirez to investigate.
No, it's closed, but it doesn't look like there's that much damage here at Philippi Park. We saw maybe 1 or 2 trees down from the front entrance.
It really doesn't. It just doesn't surprise me.
The me is Laura Dent. She hosts the Safety Harbor Ghost and History Tours. Is it real?
I feel it's very much real, and here's our testimony. If you drive around, you will see that a lot of trees did come down, but they missed the houses.
Tampa Bay blessed by the Tocobaga Indians once again. That's what Dent believes. The native tribe's capital village sat where Safety Harbor is today, and these are the steps leading to a sacred 20 to 30-foot burial mound. Our news partners, the Tampa Bay Times, says these were found from the Gandy Bridge along the peninsula to the Gulf Coast. But good luck from a cemetery?
People go to the cemeteries to talk to their relatives. You know, even though our loved ones have passed, there's still, I feel, a connection.
A spirit Dent says is the reason why Tampa Bay hasn't seen a direct hurricane hit since 1929.
All the Native American tribes had little nicknames the Spaniards gave them, and they called them gentle giants. And they said they were gentle because they hated warfare.
There's no explanation for what Mother Nature does.
Not everyone believes it.
But Safety Harbor, safe harbor. Even the pirates came here because it was a safe harbor.
In Pinellas County, Stephanie Ramirez, 10 News.
For those not familiar, Tampa Bay is a large natural harbor connected to the Gulf of Mexico on the west coast of central Florida. This body of water consists of Hillsborough Bay, McKay Bay, Old Tampa Bay, Middle Tampa Bay, and Lower Tampa Bay, as well as numerous estuaries and bordering wetlands. The region is also exceptionally rich in springs, which have long been lauded for their healing properties. On top of that, the Bay Area is widely believed to possess Earth's most agreeable climate, both in terms of temperature and weather. For these reasons, the region has been thoroughly populated from both ancient to modern times, as evidenced by the multitude of native burial mounds, shell middens, and man-made waterways present there. When Hernando de Soto first landed in Tampa Bay around 1539, he glorified the region by labeling it La Bahia de Espiritu Santo, meaning the Bay of the Holy Spirit. This may relate to the high concentration of lightning strikes that West Central Florida receives every year during the summer months. Believe it or not, the word Tampa actually meant sticks of fire in the native tongue, referring to the extreme rate of lightning strikes in the area. This part of Florida is not only the lightning capital of America, but the entire world, according to some experts. Geoscientist and professor at University of South Florida, Matthew Pasek, declared in April 2023 that, quote, Florida is the lightning capital of the world, end quote. Would you believe it if Tampa had a nearly identical meaning in English? The word tamp means to strike down repeatedly, as would the wielder of a hammer. It is this act which has forever been the universal symbol of thunder. Interestingly, we find similar prefixes in front of many words having to do with both thunderous noise and bursts of energy, such as temper, tambourine, tom-tom, tempo, and of course, timpani, the most thunderous of all man's musical instruments. While the mysteries of Tampa Bay have been discussed at length in other videos of mine, this presentation will focus on the famous hurricane protection blessing attributed to it. Of the modern localities comprising the Tampa Bay area, we will focus on the one most associated with the blessing, Safety Harbor. Safety Harbor is a city located at the north end of Tampa Bay's interior. Its name comes from the fact that piracy was once rampant in the Gulf of Mexico. Thus, when a vessel had reached this far inland, it was finally safe from further attacks. The area is world famous for a natural spring and subsequent health spa, which is still operating today. Let it be known that Safety Harbor is no stranger to folklore. Espiritu Santo Springs is believed by many locals to have been the original fountain which the Spanish had sought so fervently, as evidenced by its name. This particular resort boasted 5 separate springheads, each designated for a specific ailment or part of the body. Locally believed to be the fountain of youth, water from this spring was once bottled and shipped all across the earth as a medicine and spiritual aid. These legendary fountains are themselves believed by many to cast a blessing of protection over the land, although the association of these springs with hurricanes is not a widely recognized one. Although one could make the argument that hurricanes, which seek deep, warm water, are repelled by the comparatively frigid springs. But this is merely a hypothesis. As you will see, it is a separate topographical feature with which the native blessing is most associated. Before the arrival of the Spanish, this region was home to an indigenous nation known as the Tocobaga, with that name denoting both their king and capital city, as was common among the Florida chiefdoms. The Safety Harbor site, located within Felipe Park, served as their principal citadel, a center of both trade and ceremony. This park is marked by large hills, ridges, and sudden changes in elevation, none of which are typical to peninsular Florida. At its peak, Tampa Bay was home to anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 Tocobagans. I tend to agree with the latter. This would make ancient Tampa quite the megalopolis for its time. Some of the smaller chiefdoms, which are often generalized as Tocobaga, include the Mocoso, Hirihigua, Neguarite, Kapoloi, and Uzita. Although isolated on the Florida peninsula, this group's trade networks extended far across the United States. In their archaeological sites, we find gold from Georgia and copper from the Great Lakes. Maize or corn was also shipped in and out of Tocobaga territory. Shells and Yopon holly served as their principal exports, as these were coveted goods in pre-Columbian times. The Tocobaga were known to be extremely tall, with the men potentially averaging 7 feet in height, as evidenced by the skeletons removed from the mounds and springs of that area. Upon initial arrival to Florida, the Spanish conquistadors and French Huguenots independently reported men who averaged 1.5 feet taller than themselves, barefoot, I mind you. The warriors tied up their long, charcoal black hair upon the top of their heads with grass fibers to enhance their height even further. One of the Spanish explorers was to later record that, quote, "The Florida Indians go naked and are large of body and appear, at a distance, like giants and fearful to look upon." For food, the Tocobaga collected vast amounts of shellfish during the warm seasons, with the leftover shells being discarded in heaps, known as middens. It is believed by some that only the women contributed to the piling up of these shells. In addition to their status as elite fishermen, the Tocobaga partook of wild fruit to a greater extent than their neighbors. This diet likely included muscadine grapes, sea grapes, cocoa plums, mulberry, beautyberry, elderberry, persimmon, pawpaw, bird pepper, palmberry, passion fruit, and even papaya. They made great use of maize, palm hearts, kunti, greenbrier, acorns, amaranth, spatterdock, along with many other roots, nuts, and herbs. Among their favored animal foods were manatee, turtle, eel, and alligator. Dog may also have been on the menu, as many tribes in Florida bred the canine for the purpose of consumption. As with all the tribes of Florida, the bow was the weapon of choice in both combat and the hunt. However, the atlatl was still being used in this region with unusual frequency at the time of Spanish arrival. The following comes to us from Savages of the Sun by Tony Pizzo in regards to the Tocobaga. Quote, "The Tocobaga spoke a dialect of the musical Timucuan language, lingua franca, a noble and general language used throughout the peninsula. The Tocobagas were strong and savagely handsome, with bronze-colored skin. They possessed great prowess and courage, clad in air and sun, with the exception of a breechcloth. They adorned themselves with colorful feathers, shell necklaces, bracelets made of fish teeth, and pearl anklets. Some of their more attractive ornaments were the small fish bladders they wore as earrings. What rendered their appearance even more formidable were the colorful tattoo designs on their bodies, which enhanced their beauty, while recording their warlike exploits. They set a precedent for future Floridians by being the first to use insect repellents and suntan lotion. During the heat of the summer, they covered their bodies with smelly fish oils to repel gnats and mosquitoes, and for protection from the rays of the hot sun. In ancient times, the forerunner of the Tocobagas lived on and around shell middens. A large part of their food fare was shellfish. The shells of these fish make up the bulk of the tremendous shell middens found along the shores of Tampa Bay. Their dead were covered in the shell heaps, along with all types of refuse. These old kitchen middens have contributed much valuable information on the primitive inhabitants of the Tampa Bay region. In these shell heaps, the bones of small animals have been found, such as dogs, raccoons, and a possum. Dogs, the only domestic animals, were frequently eaten, even kept and raised for the purpose. Turtles, snakes, and alligators were used. On the event of the arrival of the Spaniards, Indian villages dotted the shores of Tampa Bay, and a temple mound dominated the scene in the more important villages. These large mounds were flat-topped, rectangular in shape, with a ramp leading to the top. On the summit were houses for chiefs and priests, and elaborate wooden bird carvings adorned the roofs of the houses. It is believed that the temple mound tradition originated in northeastern Mexico. There were at least 19 temple mounds at Tampa Bay." End quote. It is with the mounds and middens of the Bay Area that we get the most popular rendition of the hurricane protection story. The Tocobaga took great care to inter their esteemed leaders in these mounds, casting powerful blessings over them. It is these blessings which locals point to as the cause of the protection from hurricanes. Some of the notable Tocobaga mounds and middens which can still be visited today include the Olsner Mound, Pillsbury Mound, Jungle Prada Site, Maximo Park Site, Pinellas Point Temple Mound, Anclote River Site, Madeira Bickle Mound Site, Prine Burial Mound, Portavant Mound, Hospital Park Mound, Pithlochascuti River Mound, and Big Cockroach Mound, among many others. Let us resume from Savages of the Sun in regards to the spirituality of the Tocobaga. Quote, "The Indians were sun worshippers, and the chiefs claimed to be descendants of Tonatico, the sun. On special occasions they gathered for great religious festivals. Upon the death of a chief, his subjects fasted for 3 days. The women cut off half of their long hair. Certain women were designated to mourn their chief with great wailing 3 times a day for a period of 6 months. One of the strangest funeral cult practices was observed by Father Juan Rogel of the Society of Jesus in 1567 in the village of Tocobaga, an ancient Indian settlement on the site of Felipe Park on Old Tampa Bay. Father Rogel, the first resident priest of the Bay Area, made the first efforts to convert the Indians to Christianity. Here is Father Rogel's description of the macabre cult. Quote, At the death of a chief, his body is divided into small pieces and cooked for 2 days, until the skin could be removed from the bones. Then the skeleton was reconstructed. During the 4 days which were required, a fast was observed, and on the 4th day, the entire village accompanies the bones, in procession, to a temple in which the reconstructed skeleton was deposited amidst the reverences of the assembly. All who attended the processions were said to gain indulgences." End quote. Father Rogel also preserved for us another strange custom of the Tocobagas. Quote, "When an Indian took sick, they believed that one of his souls had left his body. The sorcerer then could go into the forest to look for the wayward soul. He returns, guiding the lost soul as a herder would lead his goats into a corral. While the sorcerer holds the patient by the neck, the lost soul is re-entered into the body. The sick Indian is placed in a circle of small fires to keep the soul from escaping." The Tocobagas also believed that after death, the principal soul entered the body of a beast or fish, and upon the death of one of those, the soul re-enters into a smaller animal. This process continues until there is nothing left. This belief was so ingrained into the brain of the Tocobagas that converting them to the Christian doctrine of immortality of the soul and its resurrection was practically an impossible task. But the Tocobagas did believe in their concept of immortality. They were happy to die in battle, as it assured them another life. Their main concern was that their bones be preserved for burial in a mound. About the time of the coming of the Spaniards, the custom of covering the dead in these old kitchen middens was abandoned. The elaborate ceremony of burying the dead in earthen mounds became the practice. The burial mounds were usually located near the village. The dead were buried with many grave goods such as spear points, clay points, ornaments, and other worldly possessions. One of the most notable temple mounds in the Bay Area was located in Tampa, near the intersection of Morgan Street and Elema Avenue, near the shore of the open bay, now the Hendry and Knight Channel. D.B. McKay, a pioneer Tampan, former mayor, and Florida historian, gave us, from his personal memory, a description of the mound. Quote, "This mound was one of the largest in Florida, at least 50 feet in height, with a large, level space on top. The base covered an area nearly as large as a city block. Many years and a large force of laborers, much have been employed in its building." Daniel G. Brinton noted in his scholarly book, The Florida Peninsula, 1859, that, quote, "There is a ceremonial mound on the government reserve, Fort Brooke in Tampa. The high mound, made with hands, at the spot where De Soto landed, and which is supposed by some to be that one still seen in the village of Tampa. The Indians must have carried millions of baskets of full earth from a nearby borrow pit to build the Tampa mound. When the Americans arrived, they found a deep scar in the earth where Jackson Street is now located. It extended from Morgan Street to the river. The pioneers referred to the borrow pit as the Jackson Street Ditch." McKay, in his Pioneer Florida series in the Tampa Tribune, wrote that, quote, "A great ditch on Jackson Street, extending from Morgan Street to the Hillsborough River, the full width of the street, and from Florida Avenue to the river, averaging 25 feet deep. The ditch was crossed by wagon and footbridges at Florida Avenue, Franklin, Tampa, and Water Streets." End quote. While it is true that the entirety of Florida was dotted with ancient mounds, middens, and earthworks, the Tampa Bay area boasts the highest concentration by far. It is these mounds which are believed to be the primary cause of the hurricane blessing. The natives took great care to inter their esteemed leaders in them, and thus they were consecrated for eternity. Contrary to the negative superstitions, I, personally, find burial mounds to be quite peaceful. Another distinguishing characteristic of the Tocobaga is their alleged friendliness towards Europeans. While some accounts label them as the most warlike in all of Florida, they rank among the most docile tribes known to the Florida historian. The Tocobaga greeted each new wave of Spaniards with goodwill, even after the previous party may have wronged them. This, coupled with their exceptional height, earned them the nickname of gentle giants, or the Spanish equivalent, by the conquistadors and missionaries who encountered them. We know that the tribe was perfectly capable of waging war, but they exemplified their pacific disposition through great diplomacy. It is with this peaceful reputation that we find our second possible origin of the hurricane blessing. It is believed by many that the virtues of this specific tribe, in general, resulted in the grand blessing of protection. However, the specific catalyst for this blessing, passing on to the subsequent settlers of Florida, is a certain peace treaty brokered by the Spanish between the Tocobaga and their rivals, the Calusa. At the time of Pedro de Menendez's arrival in the Tampa Bay area in 1567, the Tocobaga were engaged in a war with the Calusa, their neighbors to the south. As with the Tocobaga, Calusa was the name of the kingdom, capital city, and chief himself. The Calusa ruled over the majority of southwest Florida and were considered to be the most hostile of all the indigenous Floridians. To illustrate, it was the Calusa who repelled Ponce de Leon's landing party in 1521, near the present-day Charlotte Harbor. The Calusa ensured de Leon a slow, painful death by use of a poison-tipped projectile. As with all the indigenous Floridians, the Calusa were of exceptional height, yet were not so tall as the Tocobaga. Instead, they are remembered for their extreme muscularity. They too depended on seafood, but were known to chase deer into the ocean, with the aids of dogs, where they would then be slaughtered after reaching exhaustion. They were known to have observed barbaric religious rites, and, of all the Florida tribes, are among those most associated with human sacrifice. Quote, "The enemies of the Tocobagas were the ferocious Calusa Indians. They occupied the entire region south of Tampa Bay, and were considered the most uncivilized savages in Florida. The province of Calusa was a populous and wealthy region, rich in pearls and seafoods. The main village of the province was called Carlos, and was referred to by the Spaniards as the Cruel Village. It was situated on the Caloosahatchee River, and the Calusas were mainly a canoe people. These two tribes were similar in manner, habits, and physical appearance. Their languages, however, differed. The Calusa dialect was of the Muskogean speech group, which some believe originated somewhere west of the Mississippi. Fontaneda mentions that in southwest Florida, there were, quote, whole villages of Western Indians who had come there in search of the rejuvenating waters of a magic spring. The cosmographer Juan Lopez de Velasco, in his narrative, gives us the following information on some of the tribal customs of the Calusa. In the summer season, they celebrated with a 3-month-long festival. During that period, they held wild ceremonies in which they wore deer antlers upon their head and ran madly throughout the night, howling like wolves. In their more sacred moments, they paid homage to idols which were kept in a temple. On the death of a child or a chief, members of the tribe sacrificed some of their children to accompany the departed child or chief on their death journey. When a chief died, his servants were sacrificed so they could look after him in the happy hunting grounds. Quote, "The enemy captives were offered as food to their idols, who were said to feed upon their eyes. In the course of the celebration, a dance was performed with the head of the victims. The Calusas were a vicious, suspicious, and treacherous tribe." End quote. Although the Calusa were ferocious, the Tocobaga displayed great violence when engaged in war with them. Quote, "After a skirmish, the wounded were dragged off the field and promptly scalped. These scalps, with hair a foot and a half long, were dried over a fire until they looked like parchment. After the battle, they would cut off the legs and arms of the fallen warriors. The scalps and bleeding limbs were hung at the end of their spears, and the victors marched to their village in triumph, along with the women and children who were spared and brought back as captives." Carl A. Bickel, in his book, The Mangrove Coast, notes that, quote, "On occasion, following an intertribal raid, there is a sinister touch in their diet. The breasts of young girls, it was said, were especially reserved for the chiefs." The following comes to us from Warren Fershine and Laura Kepner in regards to the treaty brokered by the Spanish between the Tocobaga and Calusa. In 1566, shortly after the founding of St. Augustine, Pedro Menendez sailed to Florida's west coast to visit the Calusa, a powerful indigenous people who lived south of Tampa Bay, roughly from Charlotte Harbor, all the way down the southernmost part of the Florida peninsula. The primary goal of Menendez's voyage was to attempt to discover a water passage linking the east and west coasts of the peninsula. At the same time, he would try to convert some of the Calusa to Catholicism, which was a secondary goal for many of the Spanish explorers during this period. The chief of the Calusa was a man named Calus, or possibly Kalos or Callus, which meant fierce or brave in their language. The Spanish corrupted this name into something more understandable to them and simply called him Carlos. If we pause here, I, the narrator, would like to point out that Kalos or Kalus, meaning fierce, is nearly identical in sound and meaning to the English callous, meaning hard-skinned or cold-blooded. The Greek kalos also comes to mind, meaning noble or chivalrous, especially in a military context. Check out my Greek equals Creek video for more gravy on ancient Greek in America. We resume. Once Menendez arrived, Carlos schemed to use the Spanish might for his own political advantage. After some time, during which Menendez was pressured into marrying Carlos's sister, in one of the more bizarre events to take place during this era of Spanish exploration of Florida, Carlos lied and told Menendez that he knew of such a water passage, but it was located squarely in the territory of the Tocobaga, a tribe that lived north of Calusa territory, and who happened to be the sworn enemies of the Calusa. All Menendez had to do to to gain access to this waterway was to help Carlos destroy the Tocobaga. So who exactly were the Tocobaga? They were a peaceful indigenous people who lived in villages scattered throughout the Tampa Bay area. One of these villages, of course, was located in Felipe Park. Not just a village either. It is the largest known remains of the Tocobaga culture, and was quite likely their chief settlement. Menendez, however, refused to cooperate with Carlos's ambition. Instead, he told the Calusa that he would negotiate a peace treaty between the two tribes. Although frustrated, Carlos agreed to comply and asked to accompany Menendez to the Tocobaga with some of his men to make peace. This approach of seeking a peace treaty may seem to conflict with the commonly held views of Menendez, who suffered from a poor reputation regarding his treatment of the indigenous people throughout Florida. In fact, a few years later, in 1572, he urged the Spanish crown to engage in a, quote, war of extermination against the Florida Indians. But at this time, his behavior toward the native population was quite different, and I think it's important to point this out in order to provide an accurate picture of Menendez's motivation and behavior. In Space and Time Perspective in Northern St. John's Archaeology, Florida, author John Goggin explains that Menendez himself tried to treat the Indians fairly, making special efforts to settle disputes between them and give no aggressive cause for displeasure on his part. Despite all his care, soldiers at one post after another antagonized the natives, necessitating withdrawal of the Spanish in some areas. Similarly, in the book Spanish Frontier in North America, the brief edition, by David J. Weber, the author explains that Menendez, quote, initially treated the Indians tactfully, ordering his followers not to attack and pillage native villages. But he could not overcome the antagonism that soldiers and priests aroused among the Florida natives. After sailing up the coast and into Tampa Bay, Menendez and Carlos met with the Tocobaga, who quickly consented to a peace treaty with the Calusa and the Spanish. Although the Spanish had themselves entered into treaties with different tribes, this was the first instance in North America of a European brokering a treaty between two different tribes. Remarkable when you consider not only the hatred that the Calusa held toward the Tocobaga, but also that Menendez had to rely on the assistance of Calusa translators to accomplish this task. Although archaeologists are unable to positively identify the site of that meeting, it was reported that it took place at the Tocobaga's principal settlement, which, as mentioned above, is widely believed to have been their city, located here in Safety Harbor. A number of Spanish artifacts have been discovered in the park dating from that period, which lends credence to this idea. Also, in 1900, an early settler named Captain John Walton discovered in the park dating from that period allegedly found remnants of Spanish fortifications in Felipe Park, which, if true, would almost certainly confirm this theory. This is an amazing part of town history, a renowned Spanish explorer successfully negotiating a peace treaty between two indigenous tribes. And it happened right here. Yet, to date, there is no public recognition of this event, no historical markers, no plaques. End quote. While the Tampa Bay area may remain blessed no matter who inhabits it, many locals point to this treaty as the reason why European settlers share in the native blessing. Also, the reason we have highlighted the virtues of the Tocobaga and the depravity of the Calusa is to note that the areas once belonging to the Tocobaga have been historically safeguarded against dozens of dangerous hurricanes. But the areas which once belonged to the Calusa have, throughout recorded history, been devastated by hurricane after hurricane. This serves as further evidence that the Tocobaga are responsible for the protective blessing against hurricanes. The third rendition of the native blessing centers around a Tocobaga princess of the early Spanish period. Let us briefly familiarize ourselves with the women of the Tocobaga. One account reads as, quote, adorned with belts worn at their shoulders or waists, made of a kind of moss that grows on trees, woven into slender threads of bluish-green color, and is so delicate in texture as to be mistaken for filaments of silk. From the waist up, they wore nothing, except their luxuriant, long hair. Quote, the women attended to the domestic duties and assisted in planting a few crops in the fields. Indian girls were attractive, wild, hot-blooded nymphs of the Florida wilderness. The Indian brave judged the beauty of a woman by the trimness of her figure. The men were much addicted to women of easy virtue, who were called daughters of the sun. They used various herbs to avoid pregnancy and to preserve their youthful figures. Abortion was a common practice among the women. During pregnancy, they lived apart from their husbands. When a woman became a widow, she cut off her hair below the ears and, with great lamentations, scattered it over the grave of her husband. She was permitted to remarry only when her hair had grown long enough to cover her shoulders. End quote. The Tocobaga woman at the center of this legend was Princess Eulalie, daughter of Hirihigua, king of the Uzita Tocobaga. The story goes that in 1528, a Spanish sailor by the name of Juan Ortiz became stranded near Tampa Bay while searching for signs of the previous Narvaez expedition. He and a few companions were captured by the Tocobaga on shore and abandoned by their shipmates. All but Ortiz were gruesomely killed. However, he was quickly sentenced to death by Eulalie's father, Chief Hirihigua of the Pinellas Peninsula. Eulalie found great affection for Ortiz and begged her father to spare him. Princess Eulalie, through great personal sacrifice, saved Juan Ortiz first from death and then from slavery. Ortiz would later be reunited with the Spanish when Hernando de Soto came through the area with a sizable army around 1539. By the time of his reunion with the Spanish, Ortiz had learned the languages of both Uzita and Mocoso, which were mutually unintelligible. This made him a prominent character in the subsequent De Soto conquests throughout the southeast United States, serving as a guide and interpreter. Although Ortiz died somewhere around Arkansas, his actions shifted the entire outcome of American history as we know it, and for that, we have to thank Princess Eulalie. Now, if any of this story sounds familiar, you have probably heard of Pocahontas or seen the Disney movie. Like Juan Ortiz, the legendary John Smith would have his life saved by a prominent female native. However, the Pocahontas tale is thoroughly romanticized, substantiating the idea that it is an embellished plagiarism. There is ample evidence to show that John Smith's story of being saved from death at the hands of Powhatan by his daughter Pocahontas was inspired by the story of Juan Ortiz being saved by the daughter of Chief Uzita. John Smith was even in the precise time and place to have heard the Juan Ortiz story. Richard Hakluyt's translation into English of A Narrative of the Expedition of Ferdinand de Soto into Florida was published in London in 1609, several years before John Smith published his account of being saved by Pocahontas. For this reason and others, it has even been argued by some that John Smith never even traveled to the colonies. Is it any coincidence that John Smith is the English name most associated with mystery, espionage, anonymity, and the manufacturing of identities? This practice of rewriting history should not surprise the genuine, independent researcher, as it has long been the hobby of mainstream historians to undermine Florida's designation as the starting point of the United States as we know it. A bust was commemorated in honor of Eulalie in 1981, but it actually went missing in 1987 with no explanation. This smaller bust was eventually replaced by a 11-foot-tall statue of Eulalie, but the statue was shockingly declared unlawful by the mayor of Tampa himself. It was removed in September of 2018, only months after its unveiling. In closing, let us ensure that these blessings continue to protect the Tampa Bay area by holding up our end of the covenant. We must treat this land with the utmost respect, for it is one of a kind. Always remember that there is no greater middle finger to the global elite than pristine, natural habitats. We will now conclude with Pocahontas by William Makepeace Thackeray.
Wearied arm and broken sword wage in vain and desperate fight. Round him press a countless horde. He is but a single knight. Hark! A cry of triumph shrill through the wilderness resounds, as with 20 bleeding wounds sinks the warrior, fighting still. Now they heap the fatal pyre, and the torch of death they light. Ah, 'tis hard to die of fire. Who will shield the captive knight? Round the stake with fiendish cry, wheel and dance the savage crowd, cold the victim's mien and proud, and his breast is bared to die. Who will shield the fearless heart? Who will avert the murderous blade? From the throng, with sudden start, see there springs an Indian maid. Quick she stands before the knight, loose the chain, unbind the ring. I am the daughter of the king, and I claim the Indian right. Dauntlessly aside she flings lifted axe and thirsty knife. Fondly to his heart she clings, and her bosom guards his life. In the woods of Powhatan, still told by Indian fires, how the daughter of their sires saved the captive Englishman.